our consulting physician, Dr. Nick. Hello, welcome, Dr. Nick.
Hey, how are you doing?
Very good. I think that everybody's feeling better since the last time we talked, I guess, in general.
Yeah.
Just feeling better about life and getting back to normal. So, of course, you are a medical doctor, and we all know about how, living the right lifestyle, especially the food, impacts basically your health going forward. And today's a really important topic about breast cancer. So why don't you give us a little bit of a background here about what you want to discuss today and how it impacts the average person out there?
Absolutely. Great. Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind is as we've all been so focused on COVID-19, rightfully so, there's a lot of concern in the public health circles that other chronic diseases that require a lot of attention and research focus may have lost some ground. So it's important while we're obviously thinking and dedicating our attention and resources on COVID-19 to not lose track of all the other important chronic diseases that we want to gain ground on.
Of course, because they haven't stopped. Right?
No, absolutely
They're
not.
still out there.
Absolutely, absolutely. So two recent studies came out in the past couple of weeks on breast cancer and fiber intake. And I thought they were both interesting studies in their own right, and together give us an interesting picture on how powerful fiber intake is for preventing breast cancer. And really, there are studies showing that fiber intake influences all cancers, but it's nice to focus on a specific cancer type. We know now that there are hundreds of different types of cancers depending on the genetic mutations and so forth. So we can drill down a little bit more on what's going on between the food we eat and the chronic disease type when we focus specifically on breast cancer. So it's a nice series of studies.
Yeah, and when you mentioned there's a relationship there, would it be safe to make a general claim that the more fiber, the better?
Yes, absolutely. That's what they're finding.
Right.
And in some ways, this is old news. There have been decades of studies showing that high fiber intake is incredibly important for our health. In fact, the Kellogg brothers 100 years ago started making money by creating cereal that was focused on increasing Americans' fiber intake. So this isn't a particularly new message. But what happens is over time, we get better and better data from databases.
Yeah.
And also our statistical methods improve over time.
We want to see it, right? We want to see
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So this is really about increasing the confidence that there is a there, that fiber actually is moving the needle in terms of lowering our risk of cancer.
Okay, because I hear all the time, and I mention on a regular basis, people ask, where do you get your protein? That's the general question. If anyone ever says you're plant-based or vegan, but the question should really be, where do you get your fiber? Because people don't get enough fiber, right?
That's right. So the last time there was a comprehensive survey of Americans' fiber intake, we found about 1 in 20 Americans, 5% of Americans are hitting the target that the Institute of Medicine sets out, 25 to 40 grams, depending on your caloric intake, which actually is probably a little too low. Colon cancer researchers at Yale University have done a lot of studies on fiber intake and colon cancer risk. And they say that Americans should be getting about 50 grams of fiber per day in order to dramatically reduce their colon cancer risk. Okay. And again, today we'll focus on breast cancer, but when you think about how little, on the average American gets about 14 grams of fiber. So, for most people, that's about half as much as they actually need to be getting in order to, fiber obviously doesn't only impact cancer risk, also it impacts cardiovascular disease risk, stroke, heart attacks, and so forth. So,
all right, well, let's get into the numbers, the proof. What do you have for us?
Okay, great. So the first study was a study where they looked at, a group looked at the association between breast cancer risk and 92 different nutrients and foods. And the one thing that came out of all of these different associations that they looked at is that fiber was the one nutrient, not protein, not omega-3 fats, not any specific any specific carbohydrate. It was specifically fiber, that the more an individual ate, the lower their risk of developing breast cancer. And in this study, they didn't actually look at any other toxic exposures other than dietary exposures. And what they also found is that alcohol intake, whether we're talking about beer, wine, or spirits, increase the risk of breast cancer.
Yeah, well, that's a number one first class, I guess, class 1 carcinogen, right? Alcohol. It's not really talked about, but I definitely know that that's a factor for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one idea that's important to have in our heads is that something that's statistically significant just means that there's a very low probability that the association exists by chance. But that's different than the measuring the amount of impact. So the amount of impact that fiber can have on your diet is actually quite high, even when you isolate every other variable and control for all of those other variables. So that's pretty unusual, because generally speaking, researchers know that every individual characteristic of our diet is relatively, modest in their contributions. It's really our total diet that has to add up to really impact our health. But in this case, when even isolating all other nutrients, finding that fiber is protective and that alcohol is a risk factor, I mean, that points to this actually being a meaningful association that should drive the way we live our lives.
Yes. And I couldn't agree more with that. I'm so glad you're saying this. I'm so glad I'm hearing you say this, because, you hear and you see a lot of, like, let's say, for instance, fundraising events for cancer prevention, cancer research. So many of those things have as their main, like, let's say it's a dinner event, their main food is animal products, which, correct me if I'm wrong, contain no fiber, right? And then, of course, they serve
Absolutely.
alcoholic drinks at all these events, party, good time. Well, it's almost like they're missing the science altogether, because they're doing things that cause cancer and promote cancer rather than what you're talking about right now, which is the facts, and that's what we need to stick with, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that's a really great point too, where, we get so caught up and swept up with these ideas of, and you're seeing it with COVID-19 too, where we get so swept up with the idea of, okay, let's completely fix this. We need a miracle cure for cancer. And while that's true, and it's important to focus on, trying to shoot the moon and get a definitive cure, which, that research is incredible. I participated in that kind of research and was looking to find cures. So for breast cancer and pancreatic cancer. So I'm not, questioning the value of that, but I do think it's important to also have in mind that there's a lot we can all do to lower our risk. In the same way, you wouldn't say, well, because a vaccine's on its way, we're not going to wear face masks. It's both things need to be happening simultaneously, and it's important that we value them equally, not just in a public health crisis like what we're seeing with COVID-19, but with cancer as well.
So what role do lifestyle factors play? I mean, is this using or eating enough fiber? Would you consider that a lifestyle factor here in relation to cancer, breast cancer?
Yeah, and the second study I wanted to share with you points to this directly, because what they did is they brought together 20 different studies that have been done over the past 10 or 12 years. And they looked at all of these studies, and all of the studies were individually either observational studies or randomized control trials, but they looked at all of that data, aggregated it together to say, okay, can we get a definite, it's called a meta-analysis. And the idea is, can we get a really strong signal here so that we can proceed with confidence that fiber is something we really want to recommend to individuals? And keep in mind, meta-analyses, it's oftentimes very difficult to see a signal coming out of a meta-analysis. In fact, things like recently there was a meta-analysis done for erectile dysfunction drugs, and those drugs were found to not actually be effective for producing erections. And
For the purpose.
we all commonly believe that these are very powerful drugs. Same with antidepressive medications. We all generally consider these the standard of care, but when you do these meta-analyses, many times they're not the value or the impact of the intervention gets drowned out. So if something comes out as statistically significant, we know that it's very likely that there's a meaningful effect there. And of course, like you can imagine, fiber was shown to decrease the risk of breast cancer by 8%, which 8% sounds like a small number, but when you think about how they control for every other variable, including age, body mass index, other nutritional intake, exercise, chronic disease. If fiber alone as a single variable is strong enough to decrease your risk by 8%, even all other things, every other aspect of your life being equal, then that's a pretty meaningful effect. And I mean, and to your point about lifestyle changes, the reality is the reason I try to really promote the thinking about your total diet and actually your total lifestyle, as you mentioned, is because all of these things work hand in hand. You eat more fiber, you feel full more quickly, then you don't eat the junk food, the highly processed foods. So now your added sugar intake goes down. You feel better throughout the day. So now you exercise, so now you sleep better, sleep better. So you make better decisions the next day. So even though we know that these are all intertwined, in the science, we generally try to isolate single variables, but the reality is a lot of these interventions are even more powerful than these studies suggest.
Yeah, and I would think also that you can comment on the scientific aspect of cancer and how it develops in the body, but I would think that if you are in a lifestyle state or an imbalance to where your body is starting to develop cancer, you're also just not going to feel good. Even if you don't necessarily have cancer right that moment in time, if you're in a life pattern where you're developing that, your body's just going to respond with you just not feeling well, I would think.
Yeah, in a lot of cases that does happen, and generally speaking, the cancers have generally progressed a little further along for you to actually have generalized symptoms. Oftentimes when they're localized, there's not enough systemic spread for you to actually feel symptomatic, but it does point to an important aspect here, which is that the things that increase your risk of developing cancer are the same things that increase your risk of obesity, diabetes, heart disease. Whenever Harvard does these big epidemiological studies, the risk factors for one are risk factors for all. All of these chronic diseases have the same, they don't have the exact same mechanisms, but they share a lot of mechanisms. So it's, when you decrease your risk of one thing, you're decreasing your risk of other things, and you're generally going to feel a lot better if you're treating your body right. You're also going to be lowering your risk for all of those chronic diseases at once.
Okay, can you comment on exactly how it's thought that fiber works? Because if fiber is obviously beneficial, what does it do? What's the function inside the body? How does it work?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. Essentially, the way fiber, when we eat food, we chew. Are you interested in physiologically what fiber is doing or how it's protecting us?
Both, really.
Okay. Well, we eat food, we chew it up. It's called morselization, and it comes down in our stomach. And the stomach's job is to try to turn most of the food we eat into liquid. And the reason why is because we want to absorb the nutrients in our food as easily as possible. And that absorption takes place along the small intestine. So we go stomach to small intestine to large intestine. And whatever is left over, which our body can't digest, moves along to the large intestine. And that's where all of the bacteria and other microbes are living that digest fiber. So fiber can't get broken down by our bodies into small sugars because of the nature of the bonds that exist between the otherwise cellulose is made up of sugar molecules that have saccharides that have certain bonds that we can't break down. So those fiber molecules are the only nutrients that our body doesn't absorb. And then they go on to our bacteria, to the bacteria in our large intestine and get broken down there. Generally speaking, there are some fibers that even the bacteria in our intestines can't break down. And we used to be very strict in terms of the way we would call some fiber soluble fiber and other fiber insoluble fiber. Now the science is suggesting that those distinctions don't actually make as much a difference as we think, but they're still somewhat useful categories because generally speaking, certain foods have more of a type of fiber that is important for filling us up, making us feel satiated, and other types of fibers are more important for the effect that they have in preventing absorption of cholesterol and also the influence they have on the emptying from our stomach to our intestine to our colon. So the roles still, each fiber has its own different role and a different digestibility, different microbes that enjoy breaking them down. And that science is only really in its infancy right now.
All right, are you speaking of the gut microbiome? Would that be considered part of that science?
Yeah, absolutely. So the gut microbiome, for a long time, we weren't really able to identify what microbes were living in our intestines because most of them can't live in oxygen environments. But then with the rapid advances in sequencing, we were able to take samples and sequence that DNA. And we started saying, okay, this isn't, there is way more diversity in the bacterial populations because we're getting all these different DNA sequences that suggest that the diversity is much broader than we thought. And so now we're starting to understand the relationship between the bacteria that live, and it's not just bacteria, it's protozoa, viruses. So it's a whole wealth of different microbes.
All kinds of things.
Yeah, yeasts that live in our intestines, and those populations respond directly to the foods we eat. So you can, there are studies that have been done that show that just within 48 hours, you can see dramatic differences in the composition of that microbial community just by changing what you eat.
Interesting. Okay, now changing what you eat. Our nonprofit is called a PlantBasedDiet.org. We talk about plant-based diet. We talk about eating without animal products. And, it used to be that if you were doing that type of a diet, you were eating mainly fruits and vegetables, which is, I think, still, you can comment on this, the best way to go, minimally processed, low-fat fruits and vegetables, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But vegan junk food is all the rage now. How does the fiber content relate to different types of vegan junk food? Because it's everywhere nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think it's really important to say that if you are adopting a plant-based diet or a vegan diet for your health, eating highly processed foods can be just as injurious to your health as eating animal products. And at least that's what the early science suggests. And the reason why is because these highly processed foods, whether they're plant-based or animal-based, they're generally high in added sugars, high in added oils, and they have which the potentially damaging bacteria love to feast on. So, now that we're thinking a little bit about the gut microbiome in this conversation, one thing to keep in mind is it's not just affecting your hormone levels and the amount of calories you're absorbing from your food, but whatever gets left over goes into our large intestine, whatever's not absorbed. And that changes especially if you're eating a lot of added oils and a lot of added sugars, some of those nutrients are getting through to our large intestine and changing the composition of our gut in unhealthy ways. So, and then as you can imagine, highly processed food, one of the first things that people who are trying to make addictive, unhealthy food, one of the first things they always do, other than add sugar and add oils, is they get rid of the fiber. Yeah. And, because for whatever reason, our brains love that quick hit of calories, and fiber slows that hit down. So, whenever they want to get people off of opioids, they put them on methadone because it slows the release of the opioid so that they don't relapse, but at the same time, they're not getting the quick hit. And fiber is slowing that down, which is really important for our insulin sensitivity, for our satiety, feeling full and satisfied after a meal, having the energy we need. So, if they're, I'm not saying they're, I'm not trying to be dogmatic as far as, there may be a place for someone to enjoy junk food every once in a while, but I think it's really important for vegan to not necessarily have a veneer of healthy, because a lot of people who may choose to adopt a vegan diet because they think it's healthy may be eating foods that aren't going to support their health, aren't going to prevent diabetes or heart disease. And the truth of the matter is we need to eat whole foods. But I just want to say one more thing, which is that legumes and whole grains are incredibly, nuts, seeds, those foods are incredibly rich. Any plant-based food is going to be a great source of fiber. To the point that I made earlier for our gut microbiome, a diversity of different sources of fiber is wonderful. And legumes especially are incredibly rich in fiber, as are sweet potatoes and other foods that you might think of as may not necessarily associate with fiber. Fruit fiber is great. Vegetable fiber is great, but it's the entire plant kingdom that offers, and whole grains, that is great. So
anything that's close to the way it was grown, right? Something that
absolutely,
it's going to have fiber. So that's awesome. I mean, so like my question about vegan junk food, it sounds like, well, if that vegan junk food is made of mostly plants as grown, even if you throw oil or salt or sugar in, which is not good, it's still going to have the fiber, right? Probably, most likely. But if that vegan junk food is mostly chemicals and human-made substances, and that's all vegan and potentially plant-based, it may have zero fiber in it. So you got to be really careful.
Exactly. You may buy some popcorn with some nutritional yeast spread on it, and some salt, maybe a dash of olive oil. And, that may not be perfect, but popcorn is still relatively fiber rich and it's okay. But when you're getting to a Beyond Burger, that's just, it's soy protein isolate and, this and that. They're just extracts, but don't represent real food. And, then you're not getting the same fiber content that you want to be getting. And really, I think instead of being, if at first you're reading nutrition labels, that's great. But I think, in a perfect world, one of the beauties of a plant-based diet is it makes things so simple. As long as you're eating plants, you're going to be getting enough fiber, especially if you're eating whole plants, and so you don't need to look at boxes and labels, because hopefully you're eating foods that don't have too many labals. You're eating real food.
Ingredient.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't have to, am I getting 30 grams today or 45? But and that's one of the beauties of this way of eating. So,
all right. Well, I like what you say about how fiber works. A simple way to think of that, I think, is just that it's going to moderate everything. It's gonna, you said slow it down, but it's also gonna keep you on an even keel, right? It's gonna keep your internal body chemistry from those highs and lows.
Absolutely.
Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And one of the ways that's interesting that fiber helps fight in the case that we're discussing today, breast cancer, is that it also binds. So it binds some of these sugars. So a lot of times people worry about, I'm eating this mango that's high in sugar, but a lot of the fiber that in apples and grapes, a lot of the fiber that's in those fruits prevents the absorption of those sugars. And then also the sugars that are absorbed more slowly. That's also true. Fiber also plays a role in absorbing toxins that are in our environment that we absorb and are circulating. They absorb cholesterol and other hormones like estrogens. So our bodies are adapted to having fiber. The Paleolithic human being used to consume about 100, they estimate about 100 to 120 grams of fiber. So our bodies, our physiology is evolved to have fiber as a partner, not just to protect the microbiome, but as a cleaning system. And
That's awesome.
why do we get so many cavities? Well, our oral microbiome is completely off kilter with all of the sugars and sweets and oils that we eat. And similarly, we need that fiber to be cleaning and absorbing our hormones. And that's, again, how one of the functions of fiber for protection against breast cancer is by binding those excess estrogens and removing them from our system through our stool instead of allowing them to continuously recirculate.
Yeah, so it sounds like fiber is a detox for the body.
Absolutely. That's another way of thinking about it. Yeah, absolutely. Great. Yeah.
Well, another point you brought up was about fruit, and it kind of reminded me of, I remember a staple of my diet not too long ago used to be grape juice, which I know has more sugar per ounce than Coca-Cola, I believe, but the problem is, like you point out here, is that all the fiber is removed. So you get this massive spike of sugar that it just throws you out of balance for sure. Now I see it now looking back at it. And I guess that's why you eat the grapes. You don't drink the grape juice, you eat the grapes, or throw grapes into a smoothie, keep all that fiber in there, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I've heard people express concern about, well, is, the fiber in a smoothie, does it get destroyed somehow through the chopping speed? And they actually did a study where they looked at that exact question: do high-speed blenders destroy fiber? And even though the power of those blenders is real, all of that fiber remains intact. And we have this antiquated veneer of juice being this healthy food item, but the reality is that by processing it, and generally speaking, even these cold pressed juices that you pay $14 for at the store, they do not have any of the fiber that is so important. And keep in mind, something else that people aren't often aware of is that a lot of the nutrients like vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin C, are bound to fiber molecules. And so you remove the fiber in the form of juice or in the grain and so forth to make bread, and you lose a lot of the nutritional quality in those foods as well. So it's really a shame when it's really a shame, those juice shops that are just throwing out all the fiber. That's the best part. So
well, here, I don't want to be a total killjoy, I guess, and saying everything's bad, because if I look back at, let's say, vegan junk food we talked about earlier, I love having that as an occasional treat. If I've been really, really good with my diet, hey, I'll go out for a meal of vegan junk food, and that's my present. You know what I'm saying? Just one time, not a staple of my diet, and it's a great experience. But then the same thing with juice. Something I've heard recently from certain cardiologists out there is that if someone's in a very, very poor cardiovascular condition, they actually will recommend juice, not as an anti-cancer agent like we're talking about here, because it's not, because all the fiber's gone, but as a way to quickly rebalance the body. Like if you've been eating all kinds of animal products and loading yourself up with cholesterol, juice will quickly rebalance that terrible condition for somebody who's in tremendous medical trouble. So I can see a value there.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's so important as people who are talking about health to remember we've all been on a journey, and none of us have lived the healthy lifestyle our whole lives that we espouse, and none of us are perfect. We all, and I think everyone has to find the right balance for themselves. There's no one is doing this perfectly, and nor is that necessarily the objective to always do it perfectly. I think we all have different goals for our health. For some people who are, like you're mentioning, at extreme cardiovascular risk, maybe they want to go to one extreme, but I should say, but for you and me, what our objectives are may be a little different. Part of the value of eating a plant-based diet is that you're preventing so many diseases so that you don't necessarily have to go to the same extreme as you might if, you've had 3 heart attacks and you have heart failure and kidney failure. So, and other people may see this and say, ooh, I love the idea of a plant-based diet, but on weekends, there's no way I could do it. If that's how you feel, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. Just get started, and there's no shame in that. There's no reason to not move forward just because you love to have your juice in the morning. That's
oh yeah, because I was there, right? I mean, it wasn't more than 5-6 years ago. I was drinking juices all the time, orange juice, grape juice. But it's a journey, like you said, totally.
Yeah, and there are people who, I saw this documentary about someone who was very overweight and started juicing every day and lost a ton of weight, and it was part of his journey. I think he was biking across the country. Do you know the documentary I'm talking? I think it's on Amazon.
Yes, I do. And I've heard of several stories too that say, like, if you're in an extreme case, right? If you just rely on juices, it will literally flush everything out. Not with the way the fiber does it, as you described, but it will rebalance you as quicker than anything.
Yeah, the most compelling, I've tried to get at what is the argument for juice that people find really compelling. And the thing that I've heard that I think makes, has the greatest logic to it is that I think there's an idea that you can juice a ton of food into small amount of liquid. And so you can get this concentration, this density of nutrients. And I haven't seen any studies validate that. And in the randomized control trials that they've done, when they put someone on a high fruit diet versus a juice diet versus no fruit intake, the people eating whole fruits have a lower risk of type 2 diabetes than the people eating no fruit. The people eating juice don't improve, they don't get worse. And so I think the data is kind of equivocal for cardiometabolic cases. But that being said, we're all different. And, if drinking juice every day for 2 weeks is what you need to do to change your lifestyle, like, go for it. And tell people about it, because maybe you can help someone else too. And, I think part of, we all have to be humble. I don't pretend to have the answer for everyone. I just want to try to share what the science says about the best possible ways of eating. And then we all need to find ways. And when I work with clients, I'm always thinking about how can I adapt what we know to, a person's own specific needs. So.
Okay, well, let me finish up with 2 things here that kind of summarize, I think.
Yeah.
Like with the juice, I want to point out 2 non-scientific things about that I recognize, is that there's no cholesterol in juice, and there's, I think, little to no fat. So if anybody out there has a problem eating too much cholesterol and fat, which is everyone, they're going to benefit from drinking juice instead of those cholesterol and fat laden items. And then the other thing is talking about fiber and breast cancer. You were talking about how people have different goals. Everyone's at a different spot in their journey. But I would say with relative certainty, I believe, and let me know your opinion on this, that no one wishes cancer on anyone. No one wants cancer ever.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
So the takeaway from this is eat as much fiber as you possibly can, because nobody wants cancer.
That's absolutely right. And we don't have perfect control over our cancer risk. These chronic diseases, there's a lot that is out of our control. But there's also a lot that is in our control. And so this is all about trying to lower, and, same with COVID-19, there's no perfect way of living in a bubble, but, there is a lot we can do. So, what's exciting is that there's a lot of research now that supports eating a fiber-rich diet, and a fiber-rich diet is a plant-based diet. So
that's it. Where to get your fiber? That's all we got to know. Just keep it in mind. Whenever you see
those plants,
right? Well, thank you so much, Dr. Nick. Where can people get in touch with you if they want to hear more from you?
Yeah, you check out my website, Nick Borja, NickBorjamd.com. And I have a newsletter that you can sign up for there. And I write articles every week about the latest news in nutrition, health, and other lifestyle factors that can protect us from all those chronic diseases that we want to avoid. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I am re-energized and re-motivated now to eat the most whole plants I can,
Awesome.
grown, and get all that fiber, and just know that I'm doing myself good. Of course, I can't do it all the time, but this is just another thing to keep in my mind now, to keep in the routine. More whole plants,
Absolutely.
more whole plants. That's it.
Absolutely. Great.
All right. Thank you.
Enjoy talking.